I read 32 books in the month of July because I had way too much time on my hands. So let's quickly go through them and I'll give you mini reviews on my feelings about each of the books. I started off the month quite strong by reading books 11 and 12 in the Wings of Fire series. This is my favorite series of all time, set on an island of anthropomorphic dragons, and we basically learn about all the wars that the different dragon tribes have with each other, and it's a fantastic middle grade series filled with loads of action and adventure and heartwarming friendships and also important societal topics. This is part of the third arc in the series, and it's set on a different continent, and we follow new tribes over there, so the lore was definitely expanded on, and I had a great time reading these two. There's 3 more in this arc, but I haven't gotten around to them yet. Of course, 5 stars for both. After that, I listened to the audiobooks of Days at the Morisaki Bookshop and the second one, which is More Days at the Morisaki Bookshop. So this is a duology that fits neatly into the category of Japanese healing fiction, and it basically follows this woman who gets dumped by her boyfriend and she loses her job too. And then she goes to live with her uncle in this neighborhood of Tokyo called Jimbocho, which is dedicated exclusively to bookshops. And it sounds like the most perfect place to live. So her uncle runs a bookstore there and she decides to help him out over there while healing from all of the trauma that she went through, and frankly because she has no other place to go. And it's a very heartwarming story about finding unexpected connections and familial relationships, and also about the healing power of books, which is just marvelous to read about. I gave the first book 3.25 stars and the second one 3.5 because while they were really heartwarming and cozy reads, there wasn't all that much going on in it other than that. And once you've read a lot of Japanese healing fiction, they all start sounding the same, which is unfortunately what happened with this. After that, I read through all of the backlist of Kay O'Neill, who is a very popular graphic novel artist, and the first one that I started with was The Tea Dragon Society. I gave that 3.5 stars, but then the successor books in the series, The Tea Dragon Festival and The Tea Dragon Tapestry, I gave both of those 4.5 stars. That was a beautiful series with such adorable illustrations. I loved the color palette. It was so soft and pastel, and I really enjoyed all of the diverse representations that were included in the series. In the second book, we even had sign language incorporated into the story, which I thought was just wonderful. Gorgeous slice of life series following these characters who care for these creatures called tea dragons, who grow different types of tea leaves on their horns and on their scales. And it's just as cozy and cute as it sounds. It has more of a slice of life vibe, and it's meant to be read just settling back with a nice cup of tea. Not a lot of high stakes action, but that's not really the point of the series. Carrying on with the author's other works, then I read the standalone work called Aquicon Co., and it follows our main character who returns to her mother's seaside village after her death, and she stays with her aunt as she helps the village community rebuild after some natural disasters strike. But then when they're threatened by the changing ocean once again, she has to convince the people there to listen to what this ocean actually wants and to take care of their ecosystem so that they can remain in harmony with nature without facing the consequences of their environmental exploitation. It was a great work about conveying how we are all part of an interconnected whole and that we can't survive without taking care of the nature around us. And then I read a picture book by the author called Dewdrop. I honestly wouldn't have picked it out if I weren't going through all of their backlist. But this was just a short, sweet read about a little axolotl helping his friends by cheering them on during a sports competition taking place in their pond. 3.5 stars for that. And then I read the author's most recent work called A Song for You and I, and it follows this young ranger in training who has to go through this rite of passage to become part of the Rangers Order. But then when they mess up during one of the training exercises, they have to work together with this local shepherd to prove that they're actually fit for the role. And it was a great read about making sure that you are up for doing something before rushing headlong into it, and that it's okay to heal and get back on your feet after suffering injuries. 4.5 stars for that. Then the final graphic novel by the author that I read was The Moth Keeper. And that was a really beautiful tale set in this nocturnal village, and it follows the titular moth keeper as she has to take on the responsibility of looking after these lunar moths whose pollen is the lifeblood of the desert ecosystem. She takes this role on from her predecessor, but then she realizes how lonely she is and how she's not really cut out for this life. And she has to learn to deal with that and also communicate better about her needs to her friends and the village folk who really care about her. It was a very heartwarming tale about the power of community and how loneliness can warp us into people we don't even recognize. 4.5 stars for that. So I was on a bit of a graphic novel kick because now I was moving on to other popular graphic novel works, not by Kay O'Neill now that I've exhausted their works. And the next one that I read was Mooncakes by Suzanne Walker and Wendy Xu. It follows two Chinese-American teenagers. One is a witch in training and the other is a werewolf. When they're reunited after being separated in their childhood, they have to work together to stop a local demon from wreaking havoc in their neighborhood. It was a really sweet read and there was a wonderful romance as well. I loved the representation in it because one of our main characters, the witch, she is hard of hearing and she uses hearing aids, and it was really cool to see that being depicted and how she interacts with the world around her because of that. I also loved her grandmothers. They were just so hilarious and wonderful. Overall, the book just felt like a cozy, warm hug. I think some of the jokes landed a bit flat for me, which is why I ultimately just gave it 3.75 stars. And then I listened to another audiobook called Days at the Toronka Cafe by the same author as Days at the Morisaki Bookshop. And this one, I didn't like it as much as the author's other series, mainly because of something that happens in the last story. So unlike Morisaki Bookshop, this one, it is set in a cafe and it is told as a series of 4 or 3 short stories following different characters who are part of the cafe. But in the last short story, some of the things that happen and the way the character acts, I found that quite irritating and also rather inappropriate, and I found myself quite unsettled by that, and so I couldn't give it any higher than 3.25 stars. And I have yet to read the final book in the duology. Maybe I'll get around to it sometime in the future, but I'm not really in a hurry. And then I read this graphic novel duology, which was translated from French, called Temujin, and it is essentially a retelling chronicling the rise of Genghis Khan and how he united the different tribes in Mongolia, went about establishing an empire for himself. But it incorporated some fantasy elements in that he's able to control the spirits around him. And I thought the premise was cool, and it started off interesting where he and his adoptive father go around trying to placate the spirits and deal with different paranormal situations. But then once he grows up and the conquests begin, it turned into a rather repulsive tale. I was disgusted by how much nudity there was in the book for whatever reason. Then again, it is a French comic, so I guess the French people are just weird like that. The illustration style didn't really work for me. I found the drawings too gross and eerie, but not in a good way. I hated almost all of the characters, and also I was confused most of the time. I never really understood what was going on. It isn't really explained after, like, say, page 20 what is going on in the world, and you have to kind of go with the flow, and I really didn't like that. 1 star for this book. Back to middle grade graphic novels, I read Tide Song by Wendy Xu, and it follows this young girl who wants to join this prestigious magic academy to train to become a weather mage like everyone else in her family. So she gets sent to this remote island to stay with her aunt to learn more about her powers and also to practice for the audition that would get her into the academy. But while she's there, she deals with crippling self-doubt and her aunt thinks that she's good for nothing. And in an effort to prove herself, she runs to the seaside to calm the storm that is ravaging the island. And she ends up rescuing this dragon who gets trapped in the form of a human. And now she has to figure out how to turn him back into a dragon so that he can return to the ocean and to his family. Also, how to control her powers. It was a very sweet read about friendship and about not giving up even when things don't seem to be going well, and how you don't need to wring yourself dry to prove something to people. 4.5 stars for that. And then I listened to an audiobook by Banana Yoshimoto called Moshi Moshi, and it follows our main character who, after her musician father's death, moves into this apartment to move on from the grief of that. But then when her mother moves in with her, she begins to get these hallucinations about phone calls from her father, who apparently died in a suicide pact with some woman he was in an affair with. And it's about the two of them coming to terms with what actually happened, learning to live their lives to the fullest. The premise sounds really interesting, and at the beginning of the book, it was really cool. It had a lot of beautiful descriptions of food and just the slice of life things that our characters did. But the thing that made me despise what was going on is how nonchalant and matter of fact they were about what her father did before his death. They blamed the woman instead of her father. The whole time he was infantilized and said that he fell into the trap that the other woman laid for him, and nowhere did they hold him accountable for his actions. And I found that just despicable. There were a lot of disgusting things going on in the book in the later pages. An age gap relationship that was so inappropriate that came out of nowhere, and the main character just makes so many strange decisions, and I absolutely detested it. I expected more from such a famous author like Banana Yoshimoto, so I don't know if I want to continue with any of her other works, no matter how well received they are. And to take that bad taste out of my mouth, I moved on to reading more graphic novels. So the next one I picked up was The Infinity Particle by Wendy Xu, and it was a sci-fi book that is basically set on Mars. And Mars has been terraformed, and people from Earth now go there to live and work. And it follows one such young scientist who does so. She goes to work in the research laboratory of her idol, this really famous robotic scientist who has made some groundbreaking discoveries in her field. But once she reaches there, she realizes that maybe just admire your idols from afar, because up close, that woman is up to no good. She forges this friendship with her mentor's personal assistant, who is this humanoid robot. Then the book delved into lots of interesting topics like AI rights and autonomy, the ethics surrounding that field, and what makes something sentient. I loved the art style. It had a limited color palette of these whites and grays, but I think it fit really well into the story. And the world building was immaculate. I too would love to go and live on that version of Mars. It's basically a utopia. 5 stars for that wonderful read. Then I read this really bizarre graphic novel called Stages of Rot, and I don't quite know how to classify it, much less explain it. It's set on this alien planet and follows an ecosystem that develops when a whale dies and begins to rot all of the different organisms that come to depend on this whale carcass and the colonies that form there. And it was just truly a bizarre read. The art style has the illustrative precision of something you would see in an anatomy or botany textbook, and I thought that was really cool. But I didn't really think there was a plot to this. It was more like a thought experiment, an ecosystem study, if you will. So that was quite a read to really stretch my brain power and try to comprehend what I'm looking on the page. The next graphic novel duology that I read was Garlic and the Vampire and then Garlic and the Witch, and both those books were so cozy and delightful. It basically follows a group of these vegetable people who tend to a tiny garden and help the witch who brought them to life sell vegetables at the local market. But one day a vampire takes up residence in the nearby castle, and the vegetable people elect our main character Garlic to go and confront the vampire, because everyone knows that vampires can be defeated with garlic. Or can they? What follows is a heartwarming tale of not making assumptions about people and setting aside your prejudice, and how then you'll be able to develop new friendships and build your community much better. The second book was characterized more like a cozy quest, where Garlic has to go to this magical faraway market and fetch some really rare ingredients for the witch to make a cool new potion. I gave both of the books 4.5 stars, and there's a reason why these books are as popular as they are. Still on a graphic novel streak over here, the next one I read was Snapdragon, and this was such a spunky book, full of heart. It follows our main character Snap as she develops this heartwarming friendship with this local crazy woman whom everyone deems to be a witch, but is actually much more than what she first appears. A lovely book full of great diverse representation, and the story keeps you on the edge of your seat at all times. There's some things that are mentioned in the story which you first brush off as just random character building or lore drops, but they all weave together seamlessly at the very end to bring the story to its stunning conclusion. Definitely a must-read for anyone who enjoys reading middle-grade graphic novels, or graphic novels in general. The next book I read was Stargazing by Jen Wang, and it follows our main character as she befriends this girl who moves next door and goes to the same school as her. Initially, she's a bit apprehensive about being friends with her because she has been rumored to have beaten up someone in her previous school, which is why she got transferred. But then she realizes that she's actually a really cool kid, and they develop this wonderful friendship. But along the way, things get complicated. Jealousy enters the fray, and our main character does something rather unforgivable. So this book deals with the questions of what it means to belong to a community. What do you do when you stand out from the crowd? And is it fair to judge people based on only their capabilities? A lovely 4-star read. After that, I finally finished The Eye of the World, which is the first book in the Wheel of Time series. Now, this is a very beloved, popular fantasy series, and it has been around for several decades now, but it's taken me this long to get around to actually finishing it. So I started reading this in September of last year, but I took so many breaks that it literally took me nearly a whole year to reach to the last page. This is a very hefty book. It's nearly 800 pages, but still, I imagine I could have read through it a lot faster if I was more consistent. I absolutely adored this world, and I thought that this was one of the finer examples of high fantasy. Nothing like A Song of Ice and Fire, which is a disgusting, horrid series. This is so much better in every possible way. I loved the representation of women in this book and how each of them have so much character and depth to them, and they are in no way sidelined or objectified. They have so much power within this world. Really loved how the series deals with questions around gender roles and power and responsibility. Very refreshing for such an old series, and I'll definitely be continuing on with it. I have most of the other books, so I can't wait to see where the story goes. I gave it 4.5 stars because at some sections the story did drag a bit, but overall a very worthwhile read. And then I listened to the audiobook of Crenshaw by Catherine Applegate. And this follows our main character, who is this boy in elementary school who has to deal with a very difficult life because his family is quite poor and they have to deal with a lot of debt. Throughout this all, he has to maintain a positive outlook for his sister, who is much younger than him and who looks up to him so much. He also wants to be a scientist when he grows up, so he views the world through the scientific lens and follows the scientific method for everything that he does. So that makes him sound wise beyond his years, but ultimately he's just a little boy trying to do his best to come to terms with the reality of his life. And this book was really interesting because it asked the question of whether you can love your parents unconditionally, even though they might be to blame for a lot of difficulties in your life. And most importantly, just because they love you, is it enough for you to hold on to that family when it's putting you through so much grief? 4.5 stars for talking about such important real-world problems that not many middle-grade books try to tackle. Then I read another famous graphic novel called Sheets, and this follows our main character who works at this laundromat, and she runs the place after her mother's death. But she's also just a girl in middle school trying to balance all of that work with her studies, because after her mother's death, her father basically loses the will to live and has locked himself up in his room at all times, and now it's all on her to feed the family and look after her younger brother. But then there's a bit of magical realism, because a ghost boy ends up wandering into the town where she lives and helps her to deal with some of the things that's going on. Ultimately, it was a very lovely book about the power of friendship and how it is all right to ask for help sometimes. I gave it 3.5 stars because some of the things that happen are pretty unbelievable. Like, realistically, in what world would an entire town of people just refuse to help this little girl trying to run an entire business by herself? Everyone is so mean to her most of the time, and it was just quite unrealistic in that way. Moving on to this wonderful light novel I read called The Case Files of Jeweler Richard, Volume 1 in that series. So I've read the manga prior to this because it has been adapted into a manga and an anime, and it follows our main character Nakata Seigi, who one day rescues this Englishman from the streets of Tokyo. And he turns out to be this eccentric jeweler who is there to set up his business, and he takes Seigi under his wing as an apprentice. And as he begins to work at the jewelry store and interact with the different clients who come there, and the stories begin to revolve around gemstones that they come there to purchase, he gets into a lot of interesting dilemmas and troubles, but he also sorts out a lot of problems for these people. Throughout this book, you learn a lot about different gemstones and mineralogy and even history and politics and economics. It was just so fascinating. And I also loved all of the different character relationships that develop over the course of this book. And I'm so looking forward to reading the other ones in the series. Definitely a 5-star read. And then the next one I read was A Deal with the Elf King. This was a romantasy, and it's not really a genre that I gravitate much towards, but I had heard some good things about it, and also it has elves in it. What more reason could I want? And these elves were not quite like the ones in Lord of the Rings. Firstly, they have the same lifespan as humans do, so there wasn't a weird age gap in the relationship, which is quite rare for a romantasy, but that's definitely a point in this book's favor. This follows our main character Luella, who is the village healer, but has to join into this arranged marriage pact with the elves from the other side of the veil between their worlds in order to maintain the natural balance and harmony, because if they don't get married, bad things will happen. And while she's in the elf kingdom, she has to figure out a way to solve whatever is going on there. Some conspiracies unfold, and throughout this all, her relationship with the Elf King develops. And I thought it was done in a very realistic way, like this is how actual relationships work, and they both were extremely respectful and courteous to each other. And I found that very refreshing from your typical romantasy setup, which is all like enemies to lovers or all kinds of weird shenanigans going on. There was none of that in this. Everyone behaved within reason and very normally. And the plot itself was very engaging. Luella, as a main character, was very spunky and had a lot of heart, and she was very practical. Never did she do weird things for no reason in order to prove a point. And I enjoyed this book a lot. Immediate 5 stars. But unfortunately, from that high, we go to a new low, because I read The Witcher, the first book in the series, The Last Wish, and I wish I could go back in time and just throw that into the dumpster, because that book was horrible. I gave it 2 stars at the time, but thinking back on it, it only deserves a single star, if even that. It is a very popular series that has gotten adapted into very famous video games and a Netflix series, but unfortunately the source material itself was horrid. It was rife with misogyny and sexism and disgusting objectification of women for no purpose at all. It's one of those fantasy books where reading it, you wish that women didn't exist in that fantasy world, because rather than reading about the horrible way that the author portrays women, it's better to not have them in the story at all. This is set in a world inspired by Slavic mythology, and it follows our main character Geralt, who is a witcher, and he goes around from place to place completing different commissions by killing different monsters who are threatening the area. This book is structured as 6 different short stories and then one story that runs through the course of the book. I would have enjoyed it a lot more if it weren't for how disgusting the author's views were towards women. It had a very cool Monster of the Week vibe to it, and I love an adventure story where a person goes around and kills some monsters. If only women were allowed to be actual people within this. Things picked up again because I completed Eleanor Oliphant is Completely Fine, and this book was a beautiful, gorgeous 5-star read. It was delightfully funny. The main character, Eleanor, is definitely neurodivergent, and so the way that she sees the world and the way she interacts with people, it's all portrayed so wonderfully in this. The humor in this book was whip smart and snappy, and it is essentially a heartwarming story about developing relationships with the different people in your life, why you don't have to condemn yourself to a life of solitude, and that it is possible to heal from the trauma that was inflicted to you in the past. It follows our main character Eleanor, who at the beginning of the story leads an extremely structured life. She wears the same clothes to work every day, eats the same thing for lunch, and has a very rigid routine. But one day, when a certain circumstance makes her begin to interact with one of her co-workers, that sets her on a journey of developing lots of close relationships with different people and learning to see the world through different eyes. Overall, a marvelous read and something everyone needs to pour through at least once in their life. Rounding off the month, I read 2 of the books from Before the Coffee Gets Cold series. And firstly, I read Tales from the Cafe, which is book 2. And it is essentially a carbon copy of the first book. We are still set in the cafe that sends you back in time when you sit on a very particular chair and adhere to a very strict set of rules which make you think, why do I even want to go back to the past? But nevertheless, people still come there and go through all of that to get a fleeting glimpse of people they might have left behind. And it's supposed to be a very heartwarming story about human connections and the relationships we have with our loved ones. But after the first few stories, things start to get very repetitive and trite. And ultimately, I couldn't give it any more than 3 stars because it just wasn't that good. It was boring. Since I have 2 more of the books which I borrowed from a friend, I decided to forge on and read the 3rd book in the series, which is Before Your Memory Fades. And this, at least we got a change of setting because we go all the way north in Japan up to Hokkaido, and this is set in a different cafe, still run by members of the same family. And we follow a whole new set of characters who deal with their new problems. This was even more depressing than the previous 2 books because all of the stories deal with death in some way or the other, but in the other 2 books there were a few moments of levity. This was so much more repetitive because all of the stories have the exact same plot beat. A person is sad, they come into the cafe, they want to go back in time. So they do. They meet the person who died and then they say, don't be sad, be happy. Your loved ones would want you to be happy. And then the person comes back in time and moves on with their life. It gets very tiresome after a while. And honestly, as soon as I'm done with the next book that I have a physical copy of, I will wash my hands of the series for good. Because there's only so much of the same recycled story that you can take. So those were all of the books that I read in July. We were here for a while. It is really not easy to summarize 32 books all at once. But I did it, and I hope you had a good time listening to me yap about books. At least you got some interesting book recommendations to take home from this and read in your own time. Do let me know what you have read this month and what you're looking forward to reading in the coming months. I'll catch you in my next video. Goodbye.